Imagine this. You're walking through the marble-paved streets of ancient Rome. The sun is high, the colonnades cast long shadows, and in the heart of the forum, the crowd begins to part. Not out of fear, but awe. The emperor is coming, and beside him, a dazzling young woman, graceful, silent, draped in flowing silks, eyes lowered like a proper Roman bride. But as the murmurs ripple through the crowd, the truth spreads like wildfire. That woman isn't a woman at all. She was born a boy, and the Emperor Nero had him castrated, dressed, trained, and paraded as a living replica of his dead wife. This wasn't madness alone. It was grief weaponized by power, love twisted into domination. And what followed would become one of the most disturbing, intimate nightmares of the Roman Empire. This is the story of Sporus, a boy who was stolen, reshaped, and broken by the emperor's obsession. Before we unravel the disturbing fate of Sporus, take a moment to support the channel. If you're drawn to forgotten royal scandals, deadly court intrigues, and the dark shadows of history, subscribe to Royal Conspiracies, where we explore the true stories that empires tried to bury. Hit that like button and let me know in the comments. Where in the world are you watching from? It's amazing to uncover these ancient secrets together, across continents and centuries. Now, back to the story, because what you're about to hear is not fiction. It's a tragedy too horrifying to make up, and one that history almost chose to forget. To understand how this nightmare unfolded, we have to go back, not to Sporus, but to Nero himself. He wasn't always a tyrant. In fact, when Nero ascended to the throne at just 16, he was hailed as a beacon of hope. He lowered taxes, poured gold into public games and performances, and even acted on stage, charming the Roman masses with his passion for the arts. Rome believed it had found a philosopher king, a young emperor with a heart. But absolute power has a hunger of its own. And with each passing year, Nero changed. His paranoia grew. So did his isolation. Surrounded by flatterers, assassins, and traitors, Nero began to distrust everyone, except one woman. Her name was Poppaea Sabina. Poppaea wasn't Nero's wife, not at first. He was married to Octavia, daughter of the beloved Emperor Claudius. It was a political match, cold and strategic. But Poppaea was different. She was radiant, ambitious, dangerous. She didn't just charm Nero, she consumed him. He divorced Octavia without warning, exiled her, and within months, she was dead, allegedly on his orders. The path was cleared for Poppaea. The wedding was a spectacle: gold, silk, musicians from the far corners of the empire. Nero called her not just his wife, but his muse, his goddess. But love, in Nero's hands, wasn't nurturing. It was possessive, controlling, violent. Poppaea was the only one in the imperial court who dared challenge Nero. She criticized his theater performances, mocked his poems, even questioned his priorities. And then, one day, she crossed an invisible line. According to ancient sources, she was pregnant. The heir to the empire was in her womb. But during a domestic argument, some say over Nero's lateness, others claim it was jealousy, the emperor exploded. He struck her. One blow, maybe more, enough to cause internal injuries so severe that within hours, Poppaea was dead, and the child with her. What followed was not remorse. It was delusion. Nero didn't bury her. He had her embalmed, placed in a golden tomb, and declared her a goddess. He talked to her corpse, dined beside an empty seat saved in her honor, forced his entire court to pretend she was still alive. But his heart didn't want memory. It wanted resurrection. And then he saw Sporus. Sporus was a palace servant, barely 14 or 15, born a slave, later freed, raised within the walls of imperial luxury, trained for administrative duties. Because Sporus looked like Poppaea. Same delicate face, same eyes, same bone structure. To Nero, it wasn't coincidence. It was a sign. Poppaea had returned, or could be made to return. No one dared stop him. Nero summoned the finest physicians in Rome and ordered the unthinkable: castrate the boy, make him a woman, Bring back Poppaea. This was not love. This was desecration. Sporus was mutilated, not to save his life, but to recreate someone else's. He wasn't just forced into femininity. He was stripped of his identity. And when the surgery was done, Nero announced a wedding. The empire watched in stunned silence. Spring, 67 AD. The imperial palace was transformed into a ceremonial ground. Nero wore the robes of a groom. Sporus, now renamed Sabina, after the dead empress, wore bridal silks, makeup, and jewels that once belonged to Poppaea herself. Guests arrived. Gifts were exchanged. Vows were spoken. To the ignorant outsider, it might have seemed like a royal wedding. To those who knew, it was a ceremony of madness, a funeral dressed as a feast. Sporus was given quarters, servants, wealth, but none of it mattered. Every day, he woke in a body that was no longer his. His face was painted, his voice trained to sound sweet and high. He was taught how to walk, sit, smile, whisper, like Poppaea. He was expected to remember things that never happened, shared memories Nero invented. He was expected to respond, like a wife, and the cost of failing was death. By now, Sporus no longer existed. He was a name, a body, a tool dressed, painted, and posed to satisfy the fantasy of a grieving god-emperor. But this wasn't a role he could step out of. Sporus, or Sabina, as Nero now called him, lived under constant surveillance, every moment scrutinized, every word monitored, every mistake potentially fatal. He wasn't just expected to be a wife, he was expected to be her. The same gestures, the same expressions, the same voice Nero remembered whispering in the imperial bedchamber. Every room he entered was filled with the scent of Poppaea's favorite perfumes. Her portraits lined the walls. Her clothing, resized, refitted, hung in his wardrobe. The mirrors reflected not his face, but hers. This wasn't love. It was theater, and Nero was both actor and audience, applauding his own illusion, demanding everyone else applaud with him. He introduced Sporus at banquets as his empress. He made senators address him as Augusta. He would reminisce publicly about their shared memories, memories that had never happened. Sporus had no choice but to play along, to laugh at jokes he didn't understand, to cry on cue, to reenact a love story he had never lived. Because in Nero's eyes, reality had already been rewritten, and anyone who refused to believe it didn't live long. In 67 AD, Nero's appetite for grandeur reached new heights. He announced a massive tour of Greece, not as emperor but as an artist. He would sing, perform poetry, and compete in the sacred games. And his wife, Sabina Sporus, would accompany him. They traveled across Corinth, Olympia, Delphi, with Sporus paraded like a queen. To the Greek aristocracy, it was bewildering. A young boy, visibly altered, dressed as a woman, introduced as a goddess reborn, beside a ruler who believed he was divine. And yet, no one could speak the truth, because Nero's wrath was swifter than the sword. So Sporus played his part, smiling on balconies, draped in jewels, sitting beside the emperor while he sang and basked in applause that had been bought with blood. But back in Rome, the empire had reached its breaking point. Governors rebelled, armies defected. The Senate, once full of sycophants, finally declared Nero an enemy of the state. The Praetorian Guard turned against him. Rome no longer whispered its doubts, it shouted its outrage. As Nero performed in Athens, chaos spread across the provinces. By 68 AD, the world he built with delusion began to collapse. And when the soldiers came for him, Nero fled, taking only a small group of loyalists. Sporus was among them. Even in the face of death, Nero wouldn't abandon his living doll. They hid in a suburban villa, a crumbling retreat from the glory of the Palatine. There, Nero vacillated between hysterical weeping and wild fantasies of fleeing to the east. Sporus, as always, stayed silent, until finally the choice was made. With enemies closing in, Nero took his own life. The man who fancied himself a god, who had molded a boy into his dead wife, died like a criminal, abandoned, trembling, bleeding. with only a few servants and Sporus to witness his end. And with Nero's death, Sporus was finally free. Or so he thought. Rome's civil war didn't just reshuffle power, it reshaped fates. And for Sporus, it marked a new nightmare. He wasn't viewed as a victim. He was viewed as imperial property, a living artifact of Nero's madness, but also a beautiful, obedient, trained figure, a symbol of royal intimacy, a prize. And so he was claimed, first by Nymphidius Sabinus, the Praetorian prefect, then by Otho, a former ally of Nero, then again by Vitellius, who seized the throne during the chaotic year of the four emperors. Each man treated Sporus as Nero had, dressing him as a woman, calling him Sabina, parading him at court, a token of power, proof of proximity to the fallen emperor. He wasn't just humiliated, he was used, a status symbol of perversion, wrapped in silks and smiles. But it was under Vitellius that Sporus reached his final degradation. The new emperor had a cruel idea. He would reenact the myth of Proserpina, the goddess abducted and violated by Pluto, as a public entertainment. In this grotesque pageant, Sporus would play the goddess, on stage, before thousands, dressed in divine robes made up like a bride, only to be publicly ravaged as part of the act. It was theater not for art, but for humiliation, a grotesque parody of womanhood, a punishment disguised as performance. And for Sporus, it was too much. He had been controlled. He had been broken. He had survived mutilation, identity erasure, and years of psychological torture. But this would be the end of his soul. And so, before the performance, Sporus made a decision. The only decision that was ever truly his. He ended his own life, most likely by poison. He was barely 20 years old. In death, Sporus escaped the role he was forced to play. He silenced the voices that tried to reshape him. He rejected the empire's cruelty, not with rebellion, but with a quiet, final act of control. For a boy who had been denied choice at every turn, that was his revolution. History remembered Nero. It remembered Poppaea. It even remembered Sporus, but only as a symbol. To the ancient writers, he was a footnote in Nero's madness, a grotesque example of Roman decadence. But we must remember differently. Sporus wasn't just a victim. He was a person, a child born into slavery, freed but never free, gifted with intelligence, beauty, and potential, all stripped away to serve someone else's fantasy. He wasn't Poppaea. He wasn't Sabina. He was Sporus, and that name, now buried by time, deserves to echo through history. The story of Sporus is not just about Rome. It's about what happens when power becomes unchecked, when grief becomes obsession, when love becomes control, when a ruler believes he can shape reality and people into anything he wants. Nero believed he could recreate life. He believed he could bring the dead back. But in the process, he destroyed the living. We'll never know who Sporus truly was, what he dreamed of, what he feared, what he might have become had he been left untouched. His voice was drowned out by empire, by spectacle, by the screams of the crowd and the songs of the emperor. But in his final act, in refusing to play the part any longer, he found his voice. And though it comes to us across 2,000 years, it still speaks, not with words, but with silence. The silence of a soul who had everything taken from him, and yet, in the end, claimed back the only thing that mattered. His will. What made Sporus's tragedy so unforgettable wasn't just his fate. It was the structure that allowed it, the machine of Rome. Rome was a marvel, a city of gods, gladiators, and glory. But behind its marble facades, there was a darker engine, an empire where people could be purchased, renamed, reimagined, and erased. It made emperors into gods, and children into dolls. It took power and twisted it into fantasy, and that fantasy demanded a cost. Sporus wasn't destroyed by a single man. He was destroyed by a system that let one man become everything: actor, director, lover, captor, god. And in that system, no one asked what Sporus wanted. No one asked if he dreamed. No one asked if he hurt, because pain was never part of the performance. Sporus lived a role written by someone else. He was not allowed to grieve the body he lost. He was not allowed to resist the identity forced upon him. He was not allowed to be only to imitate. Poppaea was already a ghost. Sporus was forced to become her reflection, a breathing, blinking, trembling echo of a dead woman. And echoes do not scream. They only repeat what others say. But somewhere inside, that scream must have lived. Because on the final day, when he chose death over performance, Sporus made a declaration, not with words, but with silence. I am not her. I am not yours. I am me. And Rome had no answer for that. Ancient historians often mocked Sporus. They called him Nero's boy wife, a tragic freak, a symbol of madness. But these same historians recorded wars, betrayals, massacres with praise. They celebrated emperors who burned cities, poisoned kin, or bedded children, as long as they expanded Roman power. They could not see Sporus for who he was because they never cared to look. But we can look again, not through the lens of scandal, but through the lens of empathy, because Sporus represents something hauntingly familiar. The young turned into tools, the grieving turned into tyrants, the powerless turned into performances. In many ways, the story of Sporus is timeless. He was manipulated into silence, gaslight into obedience, forced into costumes he never chose, told to smile through agony, to love his captor, to become someone else. And yet, how many people today, even now, live versions of that same fate? Under different empires, different names, different costumes. This story is Roman, but it is also human. A reminder that identity, dignity, and freedom are not guaranteed. They must be defended, even quietly, even from within. If there's one thing history teaches us, it's this: not all royal conspiracies involve poison or swords. Some happen in bedrooms, in whispers, in roles forced upon the powerless by those who rule. Nero didn't kill Sporus with a dagger. He killed him by rewriting him, erasing who he was until even Sporus couldn't find his way back. That's the deadliest kind of power, and it hides in golden halls, behind velvet curtains, wrapped in the language of love. This is why we tell these stories. This is why royal conspiracies exist, because some truths are buried not in tombs, but in silence. What if Sporus had been left alone? He could have been a scholar, a poet, a lover on his own terms, a free man, not a living shadow. He could have laughed honestly. He could have wept in his own name. He could have walked the streets of Rome as himself, not as a ghost. But history doesn't write such could-haves. It only writes what power permits. And so, Sporus is remembered not for who he was, but for what he was made to be. Today, you've heard his full story. Not the mockery from Roman scrolls. Not the crude sketches by senators who saw him as a joke. But the human behind the headlines, the soul behind the spectacle. And now you carry his voice. Every time we tell his story, not as a curiosity, but as a person, we resurrect something that empire tried to kill. Truth. Not Nero's truth. Not Rome's. But the truth of a life, however short, that mattered. Sporus didn't get justice. He didn't get a grave with honors. He didn't get a happy ending. But in choosing death over performance, in taking control even once, he lit a candle in Rome's dark corridors, a flicker of resistance. And today, that flicker still burns. If this story moved you, if the tragedy of Sporus opened your eyes to the darker layers of royal history, don't let it end here. Subscribe to Royal Conspiracies, where we uncover the real, raw, and often shocking truths behind the thrones of history. There are countless stories still buried, still silenced, still waiting to be told. And you're the one who helps us tell them. Like, share, and never stop questioning the versions of history we've been told. Because the most dangerous lies are the ones dressed in crowns.